Greetings, everyone. My name is Donna Hicks, and I'm the chair of the Herbert C. Kellman Seminar, and I'd just like to welcome you. And I know we have people from all over the globe here with us today and to hear about this most timely topic. And we're so happy that you were able to join us. And so thank you. Thank you for taking time out of your busy lives to come and hear Alexandra Barkhu talk about Ukraine. And the title of her talk is The War in Ukraine, Causes and Economic Consequences. So before I introduce our speaker, I just wanted to let you know that we are going to be recording this session. So if you have friends or if you'd like to hear this again, if you check with the Program on Negotiation website in a couple of days, it'll be up under events. And I'd also like to say just a little bit about the format. How we're going to spend the hour by having Alexandra give her talk for about 35 to 40 minutes, after which we will open it up to you, the audience, for questions and comments. And we would also like to ask that you put your questions in the Q&A function, not in chat, but in Q&A, because then what I will do is I will take the questions and introduce them to Alexandra, and she will take them one at a time. So again, thank you so much for being with us today. And I would like to introduce our speaker now, Alexandra Barkhu. She is the executive director of the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies here at Harvard University. Her scholarly work addresses many Russian and Eurasian policy issues. As director of graduate studies for the Davis Center, the master's program in regional studies, she has mentored dozens of Harvard's best and brightest students and regional experts. Alexandra lived in Moscow from 1992 to 2004. While there, she held a number of positions, including consultant for the Russian Privatization Agency, partner and head of sales at the Brunswick Warburg Investment Bank, an active member of the board of the United Way, Moscow. While completing her dissertation on corruption in the Russian pharmaceutical market, she was affiliated with the Center for Economic and Financial Research, a Russian think tank associated with the New Economic School. Prior to joining the Davis Center in 2010, she lived in Washington, D.C., where she was a scholar at the Kennan Institute, part of the Wilson Center for Scholars. Alexandra received a Dean's Distinction Award from Harvard's Faculty of Arts and Sciences and was given the Alumni Award from the Education for Public Inquiry and International Citizenship program at Tufts. Alexandra holds a PhD in government from Harvard University. Alexandra, we're so thrilled to have you here with us, and thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedule to be with us today.
Thank you so much, Donna. It is such an honor to be here. I'm so glad that that people are really focusing on Ukraine. I know it was of special interest to Professor Kellman, and the situation has indeed become I wouldn't say more interesting, but perhaps even more urgent than it was before, given the developments in Kherson over the weekend. So I'm going to try and cover a lot, not everything that we could talk about, of course. So I've tried to limit the talk to three subjects. First, I'm going to give a very brief overview on where we are in terms of the war. Then I'm going to talk about causes and the different theories for why it is that Putin decided to go to war. And then I'm going to talk about the economic consequences. And of course, it's difficult to separate economic from political consequences, but I'm really going to try and focus on some of the key sectors, economic sectors that have been affected globally by the war in Ukraine, either by the direct attack on Ukrainian economy or by the sanctions imposed by the US and its allies. So there's a lot to cover, and then I'm going to end with just a brief discussion of a paper that has come out very recently by Sam Charap and Tim Colton on how the war might end, what the possible scenarios are. So excuse me if I'm going to go pretty quickly. There will be time for questions at the end, and of course you can always reach out to me and ask me questions by email after the talk. So let me start by sharing my screen. All right. I hope that looks good for everybody. So what are the causes of the war in Ukraine, and what are the impacts going to be? What are the impacts right now, not only for Ukraine and Russia and Europe, but also for the rest of the world? Let's first do a quick recap on how the war began. This is, as you'll certainly remember, what Russia was trying to do, or what it did do on February 24th of this year. It tried to invade Ukraine from three sides: from the north, from the east, and also from the south. It was very unsuccessful. The original plan, it appears, is that the Russians thought they could take Kiev in 3 days and have a parade with the new puppet government in place. But of course, that didn't work. The Ukrainians put up a very effective resistance. And quite soon after that, the Russians retreated and decided to focus on consolidating their hold in the eastern part of Ukraine. That's the shaded tan section there, and also on the south. They had taken Crimea in 2014. And they were trying to consolidate control over the areas just to the north of that. You can see that arrow coming up from Crimea towards Kherson, which we've been hearing a lot about, Mariupol, and the so-called land bridge between Crimea and Russia. Although I would point out it's not exactly a bridge because there aren't railroad lines that go directly across that territory. So that's how it started. How's it going? Well, not that well for the Russians. You can see here what the situation looked like on the ground in May 5th of 22. That's on the left. And that's after Russia had pulled back and tried to consolidate its hold over the east and the south. And then you can see where things were as of yesterday. And you'll notice that Ukraine has made some significant advances around Kharkiv, to the east of Kharkiv, taking back a lot of that territory, although still not able to hold or to re-grasp the areas of Donbass, in Lugansk and Donetsk, that were occupied by separatists in 2014 after the annexation of Crimea. And I would point out that it's quite important that we realize that even though this invasion started in February of 2022, in fact, the war has been going on for 8 years already, since Russia annexed Crimea in 2014, and then promoted and helped, aided and abetted the separatists in Luhansk and Donetsk. And if you look at this map, it's a little easier to see on the left. You can see the purple section in the east is the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics. Quite importantly, it's not the entire region that represents Donetsk and Luhansk. These are kind of like states in the United States. And Russia was never able to control all of those. Now, this is important because you'll have read that Russia officially annexed 4 territories that it did not actually control completely. 2 of those were Luhansk and Donetsk, and then around Mariupol and Kherson. And now if we look at that map on the right, you can see the bright yellow area to the south is what Ukraine has retaken around Kherson. So Russia still claims this as Russian territory, but it was never actually legally Russian territory. And what we've seen from the ways that the Ukrainian troops have been met on the street is that there was never popular support, despite the sham referenda that were held. These people did never wanted to be part of Russia. So given that things seem to really not be going well for Russia, I think it's reasonable to ask, like, what was Putin thinking? Like, what was the explanation for the war? What explains the invasion? And political scientists and analysts have come up with 2 different theories. So, or not come up with, but they've argued that there are 2 possible explanations. The first is NATO made him do it, right? The argument goes that since the reunification of Germany, when Gorbachev was tricked into not solidifying a deal that would have limited European expansion of NATO, NATO has steadily expanded to Russia's borders. And if you see here, you can see the waves of expansion, those purple expansions in particular that have come since 1989. You can also see Finland and Sweden, which were not NATO members, but decided to join this year after the war. And you can see to the east who are not NATO members, and that's Russia and Belarus, Ukraine, and Moldova down there with the tiny M. So the realists argue that power is about size and capacity, and great powers get to decide what they need. And if Russia decided that it needed a periphery to protect itself, which has always been its argument, both in imperial times and during the Soviet Union, that we should have known, NATO should have realized that expanding NATO to the east was going to trigger Moscow into attacking. And indeed, if you look at that purple band, NATO did move 600 miles closer to the edge of Russia. It's now on the edge of Belarus and Ukraine. And if Ukraine were part of NATO, that would be another 600 miles closer to Russia. So, okay, that's one argument, but it doesn't explain what Putin has said himself, particularly in a 7,000-word screed that he wrote last summer, basically arguing that Ukraine was never its own country, that it existed in part as a mistake made by the Bolsheviks. It has no right to sovereignty. And in fact, it was always part of Russian territory. Now, if we believe that Putin believes that, which I do, then that means that he's invading Ukraine, not because NATO made him do it, but because he believes that Ukrainian territory is actually Russian territory and he has a right to it. And for me, that's really the problem with the realists. I mean, yes, NATO enlarged in probably a politically clumsy way, and there might have been an opportunity at the end of the Cold War to rethink European security architecture in a way that was less threatening to Russia or perhaps more inclusive. But it's very unlikely that NATO expansion alone is what explains Russia's decision to invade Ukraine in February of this year. So what are the other possible explanations? Well, one explanation is domestic political factors. So here you see Putin's approval and disapproval ratings since he came to power in 1989 as the acting president, and then through very recently. And what we can see here is, first of all, he's got a stratospheric approval rating compared to what a Western politician might want, right? Usually around 80% or so. And the numbers don't matter that much. What's interesting here are the trends. And what we can see is that Putin remains quite popular after he comes to power on the basis of a social contract that he introduces. And the social contract is, I know you're tired after the wild 1990s. I promise to impose some law and order. I'm going to ensure prosperity so that there's economic stabilization. And in exchange, you are going to stay out of politics and let me run the country the way I see fit and let me and my cronies get rich. And for a lot of people after the 1990s, this was actually not a bad deal. The 1990s were completely exhausting for people. Many people lost their jobs. They certainly lost the ideology that they had relied upon to kind of hold the state and the raison d'etre of the state together. And it was a very, very difficult time. Fortunately for Putin, oil prices, which had been very low in the Yeltsin years, started to go back up almost at the same time as he came to power. And so he had a lot more money to spend on social welfare programs, indexing pensions, fixing the roads, creating national projects to improve healthcare systems and housing, and really tackling some of the issues that people cared about. And he was quite popular. Over time, we see, however, that his popularity starts to come down. We could just juxtapose the oil prices, and we would see that that popularity gradually starts coming down as the oil prices trend downwards and there's less money to spend on social welfare programs. Also, keep in mind that there's a lot of corruption that's going on behind the scenes here. It's very difficult to quantify, but so long as there was a lot of money for everyone, that didn't affect people so much. When it came time for a choice between money going to the Russian state to be redistributed to social welfare or money going to oligarchs, it looks like a lot of that money was skimmed off and went to the oligarchs. So we see Putin's popularity starting to trend down around 2009, 2010. And then in 2014, there's a huge jump. What is that? That is actually the annexation of Crimea. So at this point, there appears to be a new social contract, and that is, look, you let me rule Russia the way I want. Yes, you're going to have a diminishing of certain rights like freedom of speech or freedom of press or freedom of protest. But in exchange, I'm going to make Russia great again. We have been humiliated for too long. NATO has been expanding. It's time we reasserted ourselves nationally, and annexing Crimea is the first way to do it. And the annexation of Crimea was genuinely popular in Russia. It was not accepted by everyone. There were a lot of divisions, even within families, between those who were in the Crimea is ours camp as opposed to the Crimea is not ours camp. But for the most part, there was a certain, I would even say, jubilation that Russia had retaken Crimea. And Crimea has a complicated history that's different from the rest of Ukraine. I won't go into that. But it was seen as indeed reclaiming some Russian territory that had been unfairly assigned to Ukraine in 1954 by Khrushchev. Now, that boosted Putin's popularity for quite a while. You can see he jumps back up around the 80% range, but a series of corruption scandals and exposures, a lot of them by the Navalny team, start to erode again the popularity. There are some poorly received reforms, for example, to raise the pension age, and the popularity starts coming down again. And by 2020, 2021, you also have COVID happening. And it is possible, we don't know for sure, that Putin and the people around him thought that by annexing some more of Ukrainian territory, it might be possible to have another boost in popularity and kind of revive the social contract, particularly important since Putin has now changed the constitution so he could stay in power up to another decade if he wants to. And indeed, we do see that after the initial invasion, there is a spike. And now keep in mind that there's a pretty steady diet of propaganda that is what most people are consuming in Russia. So they do not read the Western newspapers. They weren't necessarily getting information on the defeats that Russia was suffering or on the casualties. They're mostly seeing good news about the invasion. And as a result, the approval rating goes up. However, we also can see on the far right of the slide that it plateaus and then starts dropping. And that happens when Putin announces mobilization. So it was fine that this special military operation, as it's called in Russia, was going on, and people were more or less ignoring it if they weren't, let's say, in Belgorod on the border, or if their family members weren't already in the army. But once Putin announced a general mobilization, sentiment starts to shift, right? Now, all of a sudden, this special military operation is something that can affect a lot more people. And we do see some protests. We don't really know how extensive they are. Many of them have been led by mobilized soldiers or their families who are outraged at the conditions that they're being kept in, either as they're preparing to train or maybe not getting any training at all and being sent to the front. Many of them have to buy their own equipment. You can see this is a pretty ragtag set of soldiers here going for mobilization. But many people continue acting as if nothing was wrong. And this is pretty shocking to me, but on the day mobilization was announced, someone decided this was the best day to try and beat the record for a public waltzing flash mob in Moscow. And so many people, for me, this is an excellent metaphor. People are still able to pretend that the war isn't so much affecting them, at least not politically. So if we think that there are primarily domestic reasons, perhaps personal, perhaps economic, perhaps in terms of regime legitimacy, that Putin launched a war, that gives us some understanding of what he was thinking. But what has been the economic impact? Let's move to that. So first, as I mentioned in my introduction, the economic impact, it comes in two different ways. First, there's the decimation of the Ukrainian economy that I'm going to talk about in a second. And second, there's an extremely aggressive and progressively tightening sanctions regime that's been imposed by the United States with its allies. And that has had a hard impact on the Russian economy, which then has a ripple effect through some global economic sectors, which I'll talk about. So the economic consequences, the first and the human consequence that I think we have to mention is the enormous number of refugees that have left Ukraine. The estimate as of November 8th by the UN is that 7.8 million people have left Ukraine, about 18% of the population. So by population, by number of people, that is the biggest refugee crisis since the 1960s. That's pretty important. It's pretty important, particularly since most of the people who are leaving are women and children. The men between age 18 and 60 are not allowed to leave Ukraine. So it's women and children that are going to Europe, many of them to Poland, which has been extremely welcoming, some to Moldova, which is the poorest country in Europe and is really buckling under the impact of trying to take care of these refugees, and some elsewhere in Europe. But what we find is that many of the Ukrainian refugees are not going that far from home because they intend to go back to Ukraine. And so the impact on the European economies, on the one hand, has been the burden of housing and feeding people that are not at home and who don't have their jobs and who need to go to school and have healthcare and all of those things. And Europe has responded quite admirably, particularly Poland. But there also have been things that we don't necessarily think about, right? So one is that Ukraine had one of the highest tuberculosis rates on the Eurasian continent, same level as Russia. And we don't actually know if the people that are leaving Ukraine or are displaced within Ukraine are people who are infected with tuberculosis. That's something that is, of course, treatable, but it's something that you would want to know. And it's one of these big question marks and anxieties that we have when we think about the public health impact of the refugee crisis. The other unexpected, perhaps, consequence is that Europe was facing a labor shortage before the Ukrainian crisis. Here you can see what the forecast was, how firms thought that they were going to be dealing with a shortage of labor, possibly up to 30%, and that was going to have an impact on output. And in this respect, having an influx of highly educated, qualified Ukrainian workers has been a boon to some of the European manufacturing companies and the service sector. So the burden is definitely there, particularly for receiving countries, but there's also been some economic benefit to having this pretty qualified workforce. The other thing that we're keeping track of is, of course, there are many people who are displaced within Ukraine, IDPs, internally displaced people. And the estimate right now, here you can see how it's evolved over time, is that there are approximately 6 million people that are internally displaced. So if we say about 7 million refugees have left the country, another 6 million people are displaced, I mean, that is a third to 40% of the Ukrainian population is not in its own home with clothes, with food, with access to relatives, support networks, healthcare, all of the things that they were used to. And even though we do see some people returning to Ukraine, for example, after Kiev was secured, and to some extent now people coming back to Kherson, those people are not necessarily returning to the conditions they had before, particularly given that much of the infrastructure in Ukraine is now being hit by the Russians. So many places like Kherson don't have electricity or water. And it's unclear how long the people that are returning are going to return. In some, there's a lot of flux of people back and forth, right? And the burden for Ukraine and for the European countries, at least logistically, if not financially, is just tremendous. Now, let's talk about the Ukrainian economy besides the people. So this is, I'm sorry, this is a little bit complicated, but it's the best summary of what I want to talk about. And here, let me explain what you're looking at. So the yellow figures are Ukrainian imports, or both in terms of goods in the bottom left and in terms of partners. And the blue numbers and commodities are exports. Again, both in terms of the top 10 partners, which account for 58% of the Ukrainian trade, those are the ones in the top, and in terms of the production. And one of the important things that we have to remember here is that the Ukrainian economy is not all that diversified. You had a lot of the exports. In fact, 60% of exports were iron and steel related. Ukraine was also providing 15% of global grain exports, which you've heard a lot, and I'll come back to in a second. But overall, Ukrainian economic trade peaked in 2012 at $153 billion, and it's come down in the past 8 years or so, in part because of the war in the East. And it was about $103 billion in 2020 before the war started. And this data, by the way, is from 2020, so it doesn't reflect what's happened in the war. And one of the things that's happened in the war, which is particularly important given the iron and steel exports that they were doing, is incredible destruction of the manufacturing capacity. So here I have just a short extract from a table of large enterprises, the largest enterprises in Ukraine, and their status. You can see a lot of them have been destroyed. The backdrop here, by the way, is Azovstal, the number 2 in terms of size, which was completely destroyed during the siege of Mariupol. A lot of the other facilities have also been destroyed or damaged. And this is going to be particularly important, not only because Ukraine can't be exporting these goods right now, but also because it's going to make reconstruction and revival of the Ukrainian economy particularly difficult. Ukraine is going to need a lot of assistance for reconstruction if it is to avoid becoming a failed state. The estimate right now is that the economy is going to drop by about 50% this year. And so it's taking an infusion of about $3 billion a month, $3 to $3.5 billion a month in order to keep it going. But those needs are going to continue even after the guns stop firing. And I think that's a very important thing that we have to be keeping in mind, that this conflict does not end when people stop shooting at each other. There's going to be a very long-term impact on Ukraine and on its ability to recover. If we look at Ukrainian food exports, and as I said, Ukraine represents 15% or represented 15% of wheat and grain exports before the war, we can see that those exports go, a lot of them to Europe, but a significant amount go to the Middle East and to Southeast Asia. And one of the things that we're particularly worried about is what the impact of those reduced exports is going to be on countries, for example, in Africa. So in Africa, which is importing primarily cereals and to some extent sunflower oil, you can see that some of these countries are going to be very hard hit. They were spending up to $2 billion in the case of Egypt on Ukrainian imports, and those are flowing still, but not very well. And the reason they're not flowing well is because Russia has made it very difficult for the ports to operate. So if you look at this map, this is the southern part of Ukraine with Crimea striped there at the very bottom. The two ports on the right, Mariupol and Berdyansk, are on the Sea of Azov and are completely occupied by Russia. They were significant ports. And then we have the ports that are on the western side around Odessa, which is the biggest port. And all of those are in a limited state of operation. Odessa is particularly important. It doesn't stand out necessarily on this chart, but 70% of Ukrainian exports were going out through Odessa before. What the Russians had managed to do, using the fact that the Black Sea Fleet is harbored or is based in Sevastopol on Crimea, is basically blockade the ports. And you'll remember that there was a grain agreement that would allow Ukrainian grain to be exported. That's a picture up in the top right of a tanker exporting grain, by having Turkey basically supervise the passage of ships from Odessa out through the Black Sea and then through the straits in Istanbul. And that is working a little bit. At one point, Russia tried to pull out of it, but Turkey apparently put quite a lot of pressure to resume it. So that only lasted a couple days. And that was in response to the bombing of the Kerch Bridge. So if you look down here, I think I can get my arrow to work. This little part of Crimea is the closest connection that Russia proper has with the Crimean Peninsula. And it's actually a strait over which the Russians built a bridge, over the Kerch Straits. And the Ukrainians blew up that bridge, or part of that bridge, which greatly impeded not only Russia's ability to resupply Crimea and its southern flank in Kherson and in that lower area, but also was seen as, in the Russian words, a terrorist attack. And in response to that, Russia tried to pull out of the grain agreement and prevent Ukrainian grain from being exported. The Turks objected to that and the Russians resumed, but it's still going very slowly. It's not exporting all of the grain that Ukraine has. Some of it is actually rotting in the silos. And there are concerns because now the new harvest has come in, and some of those silos have either been damaged or have been put out of commission. And so grain exports are still quite limited compared to what they could be. The other major impact, the other sector that's been impacted by the war, and it's not so much because of the attack itself, but by the aggressive and coordinated sanctions that have been imposed by the West. So here we can see, in a way, it doesn't matter if the effect is from the conflict or from the sanctions. Most prices, global commodity prices, are going up. So here you see wheat prices, that's in light pink. You also see fertilizer, where Russia is a major exporter and Ukraine was as well. Crude oil prices have come up, and the food price has gone up. And we all know, we all feel inflation. Some of it is coming from domestic drivers in the US and in Europe, but some of it is also coming from the war, not least of all because of energy prices. So let's talk about energy for a few minutes. Russia, as you know, was a major exporter of oil and gas. And a lot of focus in the early days of the war was on Russian oil. But in fact, the most important hydrocarbon for Europe is natural gas. And you can see here a pretty interesting chart at how quickly Europe has managed to reduce its dependence on European gas, or on Russian gas. So Russian gas is the purple at the very bottom there. You can see diminishing faster and faster as we get closer to the end of the year. And the replacement, which has come from Norway, from Algeria, from Azerbaijan, Libya, and from other places, and of course from LNG that's being shipped in from the United States in some cases, from Qatar and from Australia, all of the major exporters. And it's true that now that some of those gas, well, a couple factors. For one thing, Europeans managed to fill their storage tanks very effectively, which everybody was worried about. In fact, they filled it so effectively that there's now a lot of natural gas tankers languishing on the coast north of Europe, trying to figure out where they can unload their natural gas because there's nowhere to put it. But the other important factor is that so far Europe has had quite a mild winter, so they haven't had to turn on the gas heaters quite as soon as they did before. Nonetheless, what we've seen is that European gas prices have come down. So you see the spike there before September came when the European countries started filling their storage, and also when they started panicking that actually Russia was planning to turn off the gas, decision that was made a little bit easier or less fraught when Nord Stream pipelines were blown up, therefore permanently eliminating the possibility of using those to deliver gas to Europe. And the prices have come down, that's true. However, they're still 5 times the historical average, which is why all of our heating bills are going to go up. It's particularly acute in Europe. I mean, I talked to some European friends who said they were taking short showers and trying not to use their ovens. And this is something that's going to be very hard for the populations to bear, not only this winter, but also next winter. And the problem with high fuel prices is that they often trigger political protests. And just to remind you, a lot of things have happened since January of this year, but in January, there were protests in Kazakhstan that started over high fuel prices. And this, in a way, is Putin's calculation, right? Our politicians are inherently weak because they're dependent on winning elections. So if you make things uncomfortable for the populations in Europe and the United States, and let's say in Central Asia or in Eurasia, then those populations are going to take to the streets, and they're going to ask for either a change in policy, turning back on Russian imports, or a change in leadership to someone who's going to take care of their pocketbook issues. And Putin's calculation appears to be that Russia can dig in and last the winter. And in the meantime, the fickle European populations are going to put pressure on their politicians to back out of the sanctions deal, to back out of their embargo and price cap on oil and refined oil products. And eventually people will come back to Russia and Russian trade. It's a calculation, and it's a calculation that Russia has been able to make because it's still making a lot of money on oil and gas. So this data is not the latest data. It was through August of this year, and it was compiled in September. But I find it quite shocking. If you look at Russian revenue from the export of hydrocarbons in millions of euros a day, Russia was still pulling in over 700 million euros a day from the sale of oil and gas products. Estimates are that it is costing them, before mobilization, it was costing $300 million a day to run the war. And if that's the case, then you could continue fighting for a long time because you're still getting quite a lot of extra surplus into the budget. Now, there are a few moves that have been put in place to try and reduce the amount of income that Russia is getting. For one thing, pipeline gas is not going to be an option when there is no pipeline or when the European countries are replacing Russian gas with LNG. Another thing is that there's going to be an embargo on imports of crude oil into Europe as of December 5th, and as of the end of February on oil products. So those goods could still be sold someplace else, but they can't be sold in their normal markets. And there are attempts to introduce a price cap, which would make insurance of tanker transported hydrocarbons dependent on the purchaser not paying above a certain price. In other words, if we cap the price of Urals crude at $30 a barrel. If you are selling that oil to Indonesia, for example, and they're paying $40 a barrel, then the British insurance companies, which are the majority in the market, are not going to insure that tanker, and you're not going to be able to send it, or you're going to have to use some kind of more obscure ways of insuring it. We don't know how well that's going to work. We don't know what kind of pressure that's going to put on prices. There are a lot of countries outside of Europe and the US who say they're not going to subscribe to the price cap, but in fact, it's going to give them an edge in bargaining when they're talking with Russia, because the market for Russian oil and oil products is going to be significantly less. And even now, if we look at the discount of Russian oil and Brent crude, which is the other standards. So in order to read this, let me start at the very bottom, right? Here, this gray line shows the relationship between Brent crude and Urals crude and the discount since 2018. And the discount has usually been under 10%. And in part, it's because the quality of the crude, it's a little bit heavier. So it doesn't, you can't sell it to just any refinery. But for the most part, the discount has been constant for years and years and years until the war starts. And then because Russian oil is seen as toxic, at least politically, the discount between what Russia is getting for a barrel of its oil compared to, let's say, what the United States or Saudi Arabia is getting for its oil increases dramatically. And that's what you can see here, that the discount goes almost down to 40% before bouncing back a little bit here. So what we would expect the price cap to do is to further keep that discount quite large, which is good, of course, for companies or for countries like India or like China that will still be buying Russian oil, but will be buying it at a significant discount. How has Russia reacted? Well, one thing is that it's reached out to some partners that are still willing to trade with it. Turkey is the big one here. You can see Kazakhstan and China have also increased their trade somewhat, their exports to Russia. But if we look at China, right, it seems like there's an increase here in trade, but even though China is Russia's key import partner, and you can see that that this share of the yellow is very, very large now compared to all of the other partners, Russia is not that important to China. So on the left-hand side here, you see that trade is growing. These are exports to China. These are imports from China. And it all looks pretty big. But if we look on the right, this is the breakdown of China's exports or China's trade partners. And how big is Russia? Russia is under 2% of overall Chinese trade. And this is probably one of the reasons that we have detected Xi Jinping and China moving to distance themselves from Putin, both in public at the Shanghai Cooperation meeting in Samarkand that happened earlier this year, and in terms of Xi's overtures today and yesterday to Biden, to Macron, and to some of the Europeans at the G20 meeting. It does appear that Putin had told Xi Jinping ahead of time that there was going to be this invasion of Ukraine, but it was going to be quick business, nothing to worry about, and they would quickly dominate Ukraine. And of course, that is not what's happened. And we see China now pulling back, probably still happy to trade with Russia, but not there as kind of the stalwart partner. The Russians, of course, have now, this is a picture that amuses me. This is also at this the Samarkand meeting. And whereas Putin used to be the big man on campus kind of holding forth, in this picture we see it's actually Erdogan who's holding forth, and Putin is sitting here on the couch, kind of sandwiched between Lukashenko and Japarov, looking pretty diminished. And this was not the only sign of that. Xi Jinping didn't even go to this meeting, but a lot of people kept Putin waiting while he was supposed to have meetings with them, which never happened before. Like Putin kept Obama waiting for 40 minutes, but nobody ever kept Putin waiting. Like that, they smell the blood in the water. Now, what does this mean for Russia's economy? And I'm sorry, I know I'm running out of time. So sanctions are driving Russia into a recession. It does look like the contraction this year is probably going to be closer to 3% than the 7 or 8% that was calculated. The economy, it's hard to look at the data because it's increasingly restricted. We know that there will be an impact, and we think the impact is going to continue, but it's difficult to know what it is. What we do know is that Russia is probably not going to grow for a long time. And even the growth since the annexation of Crimea has been pretty anemic here. You can see it's been about 3% at a high. If we look at something that's perhaps more indicative, I like to look at car sales. And what we see here, again, sorry, a little hard to read, stay with me. The black line here are car sales in 2022. And the orange line right in front of those are car sales in 2021. So here, basically, you see how many cars were sold in March of 21 and how many were sold in March of 22. And what you can see is a precipitous decline in car sales. And this is mostly because there are no cars to sell, because they do not have the parts and the chips that they need to finish manufacturing cars. So even after requirements that airbags no longer need to be installed and some of the other safety features could be overlooked, there are not enough chips and manufacturing capacity in the country because of sanctions to continue producing everything that was being produced. And we expect that that's going to have a follow-on effect on employment and on salaries and on the well-being of the population, but difficult to estimate exactly how much it will be. What we do know is that Russia does not look like this. Okay, this was Moscow in the 1990s. It's not like this right now, partially because the government is being very careful to keep the cities happy. This was, as I said, Moscow in 1992. I think I took this picture. But things are definitely getting a little tense now that there's mobilization and there's more information coming out on Telegram channels and through VPN about what exactly is going on in this so-called special military operation. So how does this war end? Well, we would all like to know the answer to this question. We all hope that the war is going to end sooner or later. And as I mentioned, there's an extremely good paper that was presented by Sam Charap and Tim Colton, my colleague, a couple weeks ago, on the possible outcomes for the war. And I just want to walk through them and what the possibilities might be. So the first is total victory for Ukraine or for Russia. What would this look like? Well, in October 4th, Zelensky said that total victory means pushing the occupier out of all occupied territories, including Crimea and eastern Ukraine. So that would be a pretty ambitious task. And that itself might not even be an absolute victory, because if you have people in the Russian political and economic establishment who are nursing the dream of resuming their attacks on Ukraine, and are unwilling to recognize that the territory is Ukrainian, you might have a temporary victory, but not one that's going to be durable. Now, Russia had a total victory in mind when it launched the operation. It thought it was going to take over Kiev, install a puppet government, and be able to control the country from afar. But now its goals have been somewhat diminished. It's focusing on the seized territories, but as we've seen in Kherson, it's not even able to hold those particularly effective. So a total victory for the Russians would mean total control over the Ukrainian political system, including the president, so that it becomes docile as far as Russian interests are concerned. And it would also require a denial of the military capacity that Ukraine has been getting from the West. So in order for the Russians to have a total victory, they somehow have to convince the West not to arm Ukraine anymore. Neither of those outcomes is particularly likely. What about a negotiated settlement? So a negotiated settlement would be an official agreement to end the war, right? It's a ceasefire at least, and it's also some kind of durable agreement on some of the key disputes. It's going to be pretty hard to craft. In general, these agreements have become less and less frequent since World War II, in part because of the proliferation of international law in the sphere. But it's hard to imagine that the combatants are going to want to come to the table, if only because Russia has been reluctant to even call this a war, let alone discuss war crimes or reparations. And they appear to want to keep open a return to the battlefield. So they would have had to give that up to have a negotiated settlement, which they're probably not going to do. For what it's worth, there is growing sentiment among the Russian population that a negotiation would not be terrible. 41% of people in August, before mobilization in Russia, told pollsters, with all the caveats of polls in authoritarian countries, 41% said that they favored negotiations. That's a little bit less than the 48% who favored a continuation of military operations. But there does seem to be some contingent in Russia that is willing to support negotiations. And there were negotiations in the early days. If you remember, there was an Istanbul communique, 10 points, a leaked version of which included Ukraine being willing to not go into NATO in exchange for some security security guarantees, but both sides have now renounced that, and the negotiations that had been continuing, or the meetings that had been continuing on Zoom, broke off in May and haven't resumed. The problem here is that the theories of war termination require that meaningful negotiations can only happen when one side changes its understanding of its capacity to win the war. So it's not that one side changes its goals, like now we don't want to control Ukraine, or now we don't want to have Russia in our territory. It's that one of the two sides has to believe that it is not going to achieve those goals, and therefore it's better off having a negotiated settlement. But neither of these countries are likely to accept at this point that their capacity is insufficient to accomplish their goals. Ukraine thinks it's going to continue getting support from the West, and Russia thinks that by throwing more people at the problem, even if they're untrained and sitting through the winter, that time is on its side and it is going to be able to win. That basically rules out a negotiated settlement in the short term. Protracted conflict is another possible outcome. And here there's an interesting study by the Center for Strategic and International Studies based on Uppsala University data, where they looked at war termination scenarios from 1946 to 1921. And they found that a quarter of wars end in under a month, another quarter end in a year, and those that don't end in a year, which is about half of the conflicts, go on for a very long time, maybe a decade on average. And if we remember, the most violent extreme of that is the 8-year Iran-Iraq war, which cost about 500,000 lives and an equal number of casualties. The longer the war lasts, the harder it is to resolve, because of course the belligerents also kind of settle into their positions, and it becomes harder and harder to believe that the other person is credibly going to stop fighting with you. The fourth possibility would be an armistice, which is not the same as a truce or a temporary truce. An armistice would involve an agreement to end active hostilities with a lot of specifications about scope, mechanisms, timelines, and so on. The Korean armistice, for example, was signed in July 1953, and it's still in place. It's never been replaced by any kind of actual termination of conflict. There would be a need to freeze the front lines and indefinitely end active conflict. This could be a militarized zone, like we saw between East and West Germany during the Cold War, or it could be a demilitarized zone, like we saw in Korea. But given the incompatibility of the territorial objectives of Russia and Ukraine, it's difficult to see how they would even agree to that. So to sum up this depressing situation, it looks like the war is not going to end anytime soon. I would say of these four scenarios, protracted conflict is by far the most likely, and essentially because neither side is changing its goals. Ukraine is not going to accept that Russia has the right to the territory it claims, including Crimea and Eastern Ukraine, and Russia is not going to give up on its idea that it has the right to control Ukraine. And until one of those sides believes that they cannot fulfill their objectives, or and this can be either for military reasons or because their economy no longer supports their ability to fight, we are in this, unfortunately, for a very long time. So let me stop there and take some questions.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much. Let's see here. Thank you so much, Alexandra. That was just so insightful and informative. There's several questions, and but one in particular really struck me, and that was, where did this crazy idea of the denazification of Ukraine come from?
So that is a very it's a very complicated question. Let me just say that there are not Nazis running Ukraine from the beginning, right? This is a complete fantasy that the Russians are using, in part because the fight against the Nazis in World War II and the Russian victory in World War II has been the seminal narrative that the Putin regime has been using to justify its control over Russia now for the past 22 years. You know, we have to rally together. We are surrounded by enemies. We did this before when the Nazis were at our doorstep, and because of our willingness to sacrifice, and there were huge sacrifices of the Soviet population, we were able to conquer the Nazis. Like, you don't want Nazis to come back, do you? And it was like, no, like, Nazis are the worst thing that you could have as your neighbor, and they're inherently dangerous. So it's kind of a very logical argument for the Russians to use. And they find certain ways to promote the narrative or make it seem more likely. There were some far right actors that came to the fore after the Maidan, and in 2014, they were never able to win any kind of seats in parliament. So they were a very marginal political force. Some of them were reformed into the Azov battalion, which was part of the group that was defending the Azov steel plant in Mariupol, but that was a pretty small amount of the population. And I'd say overall, the far-right problem in Ukraine is no worse than the far-right problem in the United States, or in Russia for that matter, right? There are far-right people like there are everywhere, but they are certainly not running the country. And I would remind everyone that Zelensky is actually Jewish. The other reason that the Nazis have resonance is because Ukraine was never a particularly happy member of the Soviet Union. And when World War II came along and there was the possibility that maybe Ukraine could use the opportunity to separate from Russian control, there were forces in Western Ukraine that greeted the German occupiers as potential liberators from the Soviet Union. This was a group, they were led by Stepan Bandera. Sometimes you hear Banderites as one of the synonyms used for Nazis. And the fact is that these people were fighting against Soviet control over Ukraine, but they did think that the Nazis were a better option. And so now this idea that the Ukrainians are inherently unreliable because they supported the Nazis in World War II is one that's a little bit easier to revive than if that history hadn't happened. But I think mostly it's just a very convenient dog whistle for the Russian government.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Here's another interesting question. Why did the West not stand up for Ukraine in 2014 when Crimea was invaded and annexed?
Well, the West did come out against that annexation. You'll remember it was right after the Olympics in Sochi. There were a lot of public statements, and there was a unified sanctions response between the United States and Europe. It was pretty difficult to forge, but it was pulled together. But it wasn't particularly significant. And one of the reasons is that the United States was busy pivoting to Asia. The history of Crimea was seen as slightly complicated because it had been part of Russia, then it was part of Ukraine, then it was part of Russia. So it was a little bit ambiguous. And I think the assumption was that Russia had to be punished, but there was no way that they were going to leave Crimea. And the Germans in particular, and Angela Merkel, were intent on continuing economic relations with Russia. If you'll remember that since World War II, German foreign policy has been driven by Ostpolitik, by the idea that by integrating Russia into the European economy, that was the best way to keep it from being aggressive and non-compliant with Western norms. And I would point out even that Nord Stream 2, the second gas pipeline, was signed after the annexation of Crimea in 2015. So the Germans were never willing to really go along with the kind of penalties that should have been imposed. And as a result, Russia probably thought that even by invading Ukraine, and let's say even if they had managed to control it and take over Kiev, that the West was not going to do that much about it, right? Yes, there would be noise. Yes, there would be sanctions. Yes, those sanctions would never be lifted, but they never expected the depth and the breadth of the sanctions. In many ways, we were talking about pulling Russia out of SWIFT, or kicking Russia out of SWIFT as the nuclear option. And they were like, well, that would be inconvenient, but probably we can live with it. But when the foreign reserves were frozen, I think that was something that Moscow never thought would happen. And they never thought that there would be the resolve in the West to actually hold on to those sanctions and gradually tighten them over time. The thing with sanctions, if you don't continually tighten them, people find workarounds and they get weaker and weaker. And that's kind of what happened after Crimea. That is not what's happening now. There's a totally different level of resolve. And I think the Russians were really taken by surprise by that.
Yeah, another common question is, what is your opinion about nuclear weapons and whether Putin would use them?
Yeah, it's a big question. I keep getting asked the likelihood of the use of nuclear weapons, and my response has been changing throughout the war. I do think that what happened at the G20 summit, and the fact that Xi Jinping has now come out 2 or 3 times to tell Putin that nuclear weapons are not an option, has, at least for the moment, convinced Russia that it is not in its interest to use nuclear weapons. I mean, it's not in its interest for a number of reasons, right, objectively speaking. But the question is, does Moscow think that it's in its interest? Does Moscow think that it could accomplish something with nuclear weapons that it can't accomplish without them? And it's hard to imagine what that scenario would be. Yes, there would be shock and horror, but Russia would not be able to take over Kiev or Ukraine as a result of that. The Ukrainians are not going to stop fighting because there is a nuclear weapon. So I think at this point, their calculations are that the blowback from using nuclear weapons is much larger than whatever battlefield advantage they might gain by using a tactical nuclear weapon, which is what has kind of been in play.
Yeah, one last question. Do you think that the U.S. Should play a role in ending this war?
Well, I think the U.S. is playing a role in ending the war. Right? The U.S. and the allies are playing an important role in terms of supporting Ukraine, both militarily, economically, supporting the refugees that are going to Europe. The question is, I think your question is like, should the U.S. force Ukraine to negotiate, right? And I mean, what I really like about the analysis that I refer to is that it's not a question of getting Ukraine and Russia to the table, right? I mean, dialogue is probably a good thing. It's always good when people are talking to each other, if only because they understand what the other side is thinking. But neither side is going to agree to changing its objectives, right? Ukraine is not going to agree that Russia gets to occupy its territory. And Russia at this point is not going to agree that it has no right to Ukraine. So I don't think that a negotiation is realistic, right? It's kind of this fantasy that you bring both sides to the table and you force them to compromise. But if they are not willing to accept the underlying principles for the compromise, it's totally unenforceable. And it would just last for 15 minutes. And then, they start trying again to take over more of Ukraine.
Well, Alexandra, this has been really quite an informative session, and you had such detailed analysis, and it really was very powerful, and I thank you. And I wanted to point out that Professor Kelman came from Ukraine. His family came from Ukraine, and he was always so interested in the conflict. But right before he passed away, he and I had a conversation, and he was just devastated by what happened. And so I think I really appreciate the fact that you came and gave this talk with us today. And I know Herb would have been so happy that you were taking part in this seminar. So thank you again. And I want to say that for everyone that we're going to continue having topics that are of interest of Herb. We're going to be talking about the elections in Israel, but I think Nicole Bryant is going to say a little bit more about that. But a million thanks. It was just so powerful. Thank you.
I'm glad to do it.
Over to you, Nicole.
Thank you so much, Donna and Alexandra. I'll just echo what Donna said. What a pleasure to learn from you and have this discussion today. Everyone, we have a number of events coming up. We actually were counting, I think, starting the week after American Thanksgiving. We have about 2 events a week up until the winter holiday. So we're really looking forward to continuing these discussions. Stevenson Carlbach on November 30th, Nadav Tamir on the Israeli elections on December 2nd, Larry Susskind on December 7th. So we look forward to continuing to see our wonderful PON Live community at these events. Of course, we'd also be delighted to see you at one of our upcoming virtual programs. We have a one-day with Stevenson on February 23rd, and then a new 2-day virtual negotiation intensive starting in January. So whatever the venue, we look forward to continued training and learning together. Thank you again to everyone for being here today. And we wish you a very great rest of your afternoon, evening, morning, wherever you are in the world. Thanks all.